everyone, and welcome to another video from the Tiny Menagerie. This is my new tank, and so far I'm rather pleased with it. It's about 100 litres, has a decent light for growing plants, and it's a little bit taller than my usual shallow tanks, so I can play at different styles of aquascapes. But there is just one rather glaring issue with it. It's a little bit green at the moment. In fact, over the last month or so, it has become absolute pea soup, with the water having this almost opaque, garish hue to it. And if you're new to the fish keeping game, then it can look quite unsettling, because it does look a bit toxic. Not to worry though if your tank looks like this too, there's actually nothing scary going on, there's just a very happy and thriving bloom of algae that's not harming any fish or plants in any way, and is very common in newer tanks that have become unbalanced in some way that favours the growth of algae. But while it may be harmless, I do like my water to be clear so that I can see the fish that are in there, not green, and so I'm going to get rid of it. And this little video is all about how to do so. And in order to combat the algae, it's worth taking a look at what it needs to survive and then trying to work out from there where you might be going wrong. And the first thing algae needs is water. Well, yes, algae has plenty of water in this tank certainly, what with it being an aquarium and all, and as that water is also supporting other life forms that I do want, such as snails and fish and other plants, I'm not going to be making any changes to that water, so there's not much I can do about it. The next thing on a list of an algae's needs is a good light source that's capable of providing a spectrum that is suitable for photosynthesis. And again, yes, as I am growing plants, I'm going to have to supply the tank with a light that is suitable for growing the algae as well. You do still sometimes hear people saying that turning the lights off will help to control algae, and this would certainly be the case if you kept the tank in complete darkness. Eventually the algae would starve and die from a lack of light, thus effectively getting rid of the immediate algae problem. This does have two serious drawbacks though that are pretty obvious. Firstly, everything else in the tank is going to be in total darkness for a couple of weeks until the algae has all died, which is completely unacceptable for any poor fish that are in there. They need access to light as much as any other animal, and having no light in there is also going to kill off your plants just as quickly as it kills the algae. And just to point out, in order to be effective, you do need total darkness to kill the alga. Alga is incredibly resilient and hardy, and any light that seeps in around the edges will be enough to sustain it and keep it alive. And the other major issue that this causes is that all that algae has just died and decayed in the tank, and it's released a huge amount of nutrient into the water, which is just going to be used by the next wave of algae to produce another bloom, pretty much meaning you're going to end up back in exactly the same position you were in before. So darkness really isn't a viable solution. Which brings us to the next thing that algae needs, and that is a source of nutrients. Much like plants can't survive on sunlight alone, they bring nutrients up from the soil via their roots, so algae needs to have a supply of nutrients in the water around it. They don't have any roots, obviously, but any free-floating nutrients such as nitrogen can be absorbed and used by the algae to create more algae. And tanks can have a few different sources of nutrients that an algae can use. One primary culprit is actually plant soils, the source of substrate that you put in specifically for plants, or especially for shrimp as well. These can be very high in nutrients that leak out and make the water really quite rich, and then the algae can use all of that up. Which is why when you do use these soils, it's a good idea to get your setup all done and aquascaped, and then do a couple of nice big water changes just to remove any excess nutrients. My tank though has a nice inert sand substrate with just a little bit of the plant substrate in there as well, but not enough to make much of a difference, and those that are in this tank is at least 2 years old at this point, so it's going to have lost a lot of its nutrient value. And so I doubt the substrate is a problem. Another source of nutrient in the tank is what we add into it for maintenance. A prime culprit is of course plant fertilizers. What's good for a plant is good for an algae, and so if you are dosing your tank with fertilizer, or plant food, or whatever you want to call it, stop doing so immediately, you're just fattening your algae up. But for most people, and probably for me, the main source of nutrient going into the tank is for livestock, namely fish food. And here I can see where I have a major problem in this tank. Fish choice so far has not been very well thought through. This tank actually only contains 4 little fish at the moment, 2 golden panchaks that I'm contemplating breeding, and 2 powder blue gourami awaiting their time in the spotlight when I film them. None of these fish are very big. The male panchaks is the largest in the tank by far, just shy of 3 inches, And so the tank certainly isn't overstocked in any way, but they are all very greedy fish who feed quite voraciously and they like a lot of food. So I probably do put in a little bit more than I should do for such small fish. But the big mistake I have made, and likely to be the cause of all this algae, is that none of these fish are bottom feeders. The gourami will pick at food from the woodwork, but they're not very effective and they prefer to take food from the surface whenever possible. And the panchaks are exclusive surface feeders. And so a lot of the food that goes into the tank simply sinks past them down to the bottom, where it can only rot. This will then release a constant supply of nutrients into the water, which the algae is more than happy to use up making more of itself. But one thing that algae is very poor at is competing. It has no roots, so it can't take nutrients from the substrate, nor is it firmly anchored in place, so it can't grow into the light. It is basically an opportunistic organism that finds itself in the right place and takes advantage of it when it does. The other hand are far more competitive, as they can take nutrient from the substrate and they can direct their own growth. And so in a straight-up fight, plant versus algae, in most circumstances the plant is going to win, so long as it can grow faster than the algae. And again in this tank, here I have made a mistake. It does have plants, but they're all very slow growing. The Anubias and the Bucephalandra are very hardy, they are tough little plants that barely need any food, and the Styrogen repens has a medium growth rate once established, but it takes a very long time to do so. And so algae has no problem outcompeting the plants in this tank. I do actually have two faster growing species in the tank, a Rotala wallichii, which I only added about 3 days ago, and a Ludwigia palustris red, which is struggling to grow in the dim green light. And these two seemingly quite small mistakes, wrong fish and wrong plants, has added up to a rather unsightly mess. Luckily though, algae really isn't that difficult to get rid of, I just need to break this cycle. And so first off, I am going to move a few cories into the tank, and they're going to do a magnificent job of mopping up all the leftover food from the messy fish above. This will reduce the amount of waste that is building up in the tank, and although they will produce waste as well, of course, what goes in must come out, they will have taken a lot of the nutrient away from their own use, and so what they pass into the water will be of lower nutrient value than the raw, highly nutritious fish food. I have also purchased one of my go-to, absolute favourite troubleshooting plants. I'm pretty certain it could fix the world if it wanted to, and that is the lovely Limnophila sessiliflora. This is a very fast-growing species that establishes very quickly and is going to absolutely strip the nutrients from the water in this tank. I'm not going to bother taking it out of its pot, as this tank probably won't be its final home, and it'll be absolutely fine in here for the next few weeks or however long it takes to get rid of the algae. I'm also going to perform a 50% water change just to reduce the amount of algae that is already present and give the plants half a chance of establishing themselves. But after that, I'm not going to do any water changes in this tank at all, because every time I do so using tap water, I'm just adding more and more nutrient back into the tank, and I'm trying to reduce that. And so once the plants get established and start removing the nutrients, and the cories start doing their cleanup job, this should stop this algae from blooming. And here we are. It's now been about 10 weeks or so. This has actually taken forever, and you'll notice that things have changed quite a bit in the tank. The gourami are no longer in here, they've got moved to the tank next door so that I can film them for a previous video, and instead in here now is a group of barbs. These guys are also great feeders and they will take every bit of food from all levels of the tank. And the cories have been doing a great job of cleaning up as well. But this has taken a long time, so long in fact the poor Rotala wallichii melted away to nothing and is now recovering in a different tank. And algae can be stubborn. In fact, while the free-floating algae is now pretty much gone, leaving just a mild haze in the water that will disappear in a couple of water changes, I do now have an impressive coating of algae on the glass and the plants, and the hair algae is making itself at home in the back of the tank. Ugh, sometimes with fish tanks you really don't know whether to laugh or cry. Luckily though, this algae will disappear once the snail population increases, and while the algae at the back needs to be watched rather carefully and prevented from spreading any further, that is a problem for future Lauren to deal with. For now, I will take the victory over the pea soup. Anywho though, I hope you've enjoyed this little video all about problematic algae. It seems there will be more videos on this in the future. Happy fish keeping everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye!